They said America couldn't win this war. Not with what it had not, with the fear that ran through its streets. Not after the sound that woke the nation. On December 7th, 1941, when the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the world saw the sleeping giant bleed. And for the first time in a generation, ordinary men farmers, teachers, steelworkers, looked toward an ocean they had never seen and understood that history had come for them. America was never built for war, not like the empires across the sea, not like Germany's Iron Machine or Japan's disciplined storm. In 1941, the U.S. Army ranked 17th in the world behind Portugal. No one believed it could turn the tide of the greatest conflict. In human history, not the politicians, not the generals, and certainly not the young boys, who suddenly found themselves in uniforms 2 sizes too big. They didn't enlist to become heroes. They enlisted because they were told their world depended on it. And because deep down something ancient stirred. The instinct to protect what little they called home. By the spring of '42, America began to move. Factories that once built cars now built tanks. Mothers worked 12-hour shifts, while their sons learned how to hold a rifle and pray without words. No one was ready, but they didn't wait for readiness because in war, time waits for no one. Every soldier remembers the first moment he realized the war was real. For Private Daniel H. Moore, it was the sound of the ocean, the endless dark waves of the Pacific. As he stood on a ship, headed for a place he couldn't even find on a map. He wrote in his letter home, "They say we're fighting to make the world safe again. But I think we're fighting so we can come back home and feel safe ourselves." That letter never made it back. In the months after Pearl Harbor, America stumbled through its first battles. The Philippines, Wake Island. North Africa, loss after loss. Every inch of progress, bought with lives that no one remembered to count. The newspapers called it courage. The soldiers called it survival. The world had seen great armies before, but it had never seen an army learn how to fight while dying. America was improvising war in real time, turning panic into planning and fear into factories. General Eisenhower once said, "We didn't start ready. We got ready because we had no other choice." And that became the unspoken truth of every man in uniform. That courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was walking toward it anyway. They weren't fighting for glory. They didn't even know if they'd live long enough to see the flag rise. Again, but somewhere between the fear and the fire. They began to change ordinary men who had never seen Europe, never heard a gunshot, never buried a friend. We're now learning what the textbooks never taught. That war isn't about killing. It's about enduring. By 1943, the tide began to shift. The impossible started to look inevitable. From the beaches of Sicily to the jungles of Guadalcanal, the American soldier was no longer running. He was adapting, he was evolving. But the price was far greater than anyone could imagine. Because before America could win the war, it had to lose its innocence. By 1943, the world was burning. Across the Pacific, entire islands were graves. In Europe, cities had forgotten what silence sounded like. And in America, the word victory still felt like a prayer, whispered through clenched teeth. But somewhere in the chaos, a new rhythm began to rise. Factories no longer echoed with confusion. They thundered with purpose. Steel and sweat became America's new language. And the boys who once struggled to load a rifle now led others through fire. This was the year when the war stopped being about nations and became about men. Men like Sergeant William H. Carver, who landed in Sicily with nothing but a photograph of his wife. Folded in his helmet, he told his squad, "We don't fight for flags. We fight for the faces we don't want to forget." Every battle began to teach a cruel truth. That no amount of strategy could prepare a man for the sound of his friend not answering when he called his name. But that pain, that quiet ache that followed every victory, it began to harden them. For the first time, the world saw what happens when an untrained nation learns to bleed. With discipline, June 6, 1944. The day the world held its breath. 6,939 ships, over 150,000 men, and one impossible coastline. The beaches of Normandy. They called it Operation Overlord. But to the men who were there, it wasn't an operation. It was a gamble with death itself. At 6 a.m., the first landing crafts opened. Bullets sliced through the water like rain made of steel. Men jumped into the ocean, their packs dragging them under. Some never even reached the shore, but the ones who did, they ran through smoke. Through fire, through the kind of chaos no human mind can ever describe. And somehow in that madness, they found a way forward. There's a story. They say it's true of a young soldier named Private James Hollis. He lost his rifle, lost his helmet, but carried one thing through the fire. A small pocket Bible his mother had given him. He used it to shield his face from the sand and bullets. Later that day, a piece of shrapnel tore through the book. Stopped just before his heart. He wrote in his letter home, "Maybe faith isn't about believing you'll survive. Maybe it's about walking through hell and not forgetting who you are." When the world woke up that morning, no one knew if D-Day would end the war or end the world. But when the smoke cleared, the beach belonged to the Allies. The impossible had been done. From that day forward, every soldier who bled on that sand carried with him something far heavier than a rifle. The weight of history. America had turned the tide, not because it was stronger, but because its men refused to break. They fought beside brothers they'd only known for weeks, and died for ideals that would outlive them by generations. In war, there are no perfect victories. Only moments that define who we become after we lose everything. For many of those men, Normandy wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something darker. As they pushed deeper into France, they began to see what evil really looked like. The camps, the civilians, the faces of children staring through barbed wire. And suddenly this wasn't just a war about freedom. It was a war for humanity itself. There's a line one of the soldiers wrote on the wall of a ruined church in France. No one knows his name, but his words survived the fire. If we forget why we came here, then none of us deserve to go home. Those words became the soul of the American soldier, because they didn't fight for applause or medals or history books. They fought to make sure the world never forgot what courage looked like when all hope was gone. By the winter of 1944, the Allies stood on the edge of victory, but also on the edge of exhaustion. Bodies were cold, letters were fading, and the men who once dreamed of home had forgotten what peace even sounded like, yet still they marched. Because even when the world burns, some men refuse to let the light die. They called it the greatest generation, but they never called themselves that. To them it was just survival. To us it was a miracle. By 1945, the war was ending. But peace still felt like something distant. The guns went quiet, but the echoes stayed. They say a man can leave the battlefield, but the battlefield never truly leaves the man. When victory was announced, the streets of America exploded in celebration. Flags waved, bells rang. And yet somewhere in small towns across the country, there were empty chairs at dinner tables. Every celebration had a shadow. Every smile carried a name that would never be spoken again. For the soldiers who came home, the war didn't end, it changed form. Some came back with medals. Others came back with nightmares. They looked the same, but inside, something had shifted. There's a story about Corporal Thomas Reed. He returned to Kansas in 1946. His town called him a hero, but every night he'd wake up gasping for air. He said it felt like the beaches of Normandy were still inside his lungs. He never told his wife what he saw. Only once he whispered, "The hardest part isn't what we did. It's what we had to become to survive it." The war had created a generation of men who learned to smile through pain, to carry memories too heavy for words, and yet somehow they built again. They built families, they built cities. They built a future they might never see fully, because that was their final act of courage, to plant hope in the same soil where they once buried their fear. Years later, when their children asked Dad, what was it like, they didn't talk about the battles. They talked about the friends they lost and the quiet nights they spent staring at stars, wondering if someone somewhere was looking back. We call them heroes, but most of them never wanted that word. They wanted peace, they wanted sleep. They wanted to forget the sound of gunfire and remember the sound of rain. There's a photo taken in 1945. A young soldier sitting on a train, his face calm, his eyes lost somewhere far away. On the back of that photo, he'd written, "I'm not going home. I'm just going somewhere quieter." That one sentence says everything the history books can't. Because war doesn't end when peace is declared. It ends when a soldier learns to forgive himself for surviving. And many never did, but maybe that's why their story matters. Because they showed us something timeless. That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the will to walk through it again and again, and still choose to build. They didn't just fight a war. They carried humanity through its darkest night, and left a light behind for all of us to follow. And so, as the world moved on, and history turned their names into pages and monuments, their real legacy wasn't the battles they won, but the hearts they rebuilt. Because behind every flag, behind every victory, there was always a man standing in silence, whispering to himself, "We made it, but not all of us came home." This was not just the story of a war. It was the story of men who became the reason the world still has hope.